Mary L. Davenport, MD, OBGYN in private practice. She is president of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs and medical director of Magnificent Maternal Health Project in Nigeria.
Okay.
Can you move the microphone?
A lot of the material from this talk is from Angela and Frankie, and we work together at the Breast Cancer Prevention Institute, and that's actually a very good website for this information, because this is politically incorrect information, and so you don't, although the separate studies are published in many, many different places, kind of putting it all together and coming to accurate conclusions about what's going on, you can't find in a lot of places in a medically accurate way. So let's go over some basic facts about breast cancer. The most common kind of breast cancer is the breast cancer that arises in the ducts. There are other kinds of breast cancer that arises in the lobules and in the fat of the breast, but the most common one when we're talking about breast cancer is in the ductal tissue. It's caused, like other cancers, by mutations in cellular DNA and the failure of the human immune surveillance system to remove those cells. And the lifetime risk for the average woman in the USA is 1 in 8. And yet the risk of dying of breast cancer is 1 in 35. It's the second most common cancer and the second most common cause of cancer death, although it's #1 for women in their 40s. And it's a big public health problem. There's over 200,000 new cases a year. And so there's also about 49,000 deaths a year. And we do know that breast cancer can occur in men. And there's some evidence that this is becoming a little bit more frequent. And in fact, breast cancer in general is becoming more frequent all around the world, and we may wonder why that is, but we'll go into some of those reasons soon. So some of the accepted risk factors for breast cancer are female. Women have 100 times the chance of having breast cancer rather than men. The older a woman is, the higher her chance of having breast cancer. And then there are certain genes. The most common ones are BRCA1 and BRCA2, and they cause up to 80% of a lifetime risk for breast cancer. Certainly family history is a big risk factor. Having had breast cancer already in one breast can predispose you to having breast cancer in another breast or at another site on the same breast. Caucasian women have it more often. And then if you have certain benign breast conditions, not all fibrocystic disease, but benign breast conditions with atypia that can predispose you. Also, early menarche and late menopause, the more cycles you have in your life, the more exposure to estrogen is the common denominator. Breast radiation, treatment with diethylstilbestrol. Now, we don't see that happen that much anymore, but that was something that happened way in the past. Nulliparity, late childbearing, and contraceptives are a cause of breast cancer. There's kind of mixed literature, but if we're talking about oral contraceptives before the first full-term pregnancy, and especially the triple negative breast cancer, the kind that young women get and that is more deadly, there's been recent very good literature that's been accepted that shows the causal link. Postmenopausal hormone replacement therapy, not breastfeeding, and then alcohol, obesity, and lack of exercise are correlated with breast cancer. Now, some of the controversial links include vitamins, diet, antiperspirants, breast implants, pollution, tobacco smoke, working at night, and induced abortion I have to put on an uncertain risk factor, meaning not commonly accepted. Now, I don't think it belongs there, and I'll go into that. So the typical groups that discredit and I'm going to call it the ABC link, abortion, breast cancer, are the National Cancer Institute, Breast Cancer Coalition, ACOG, American College of OBGYN, and American Cancer Society. These are really the big organizations. But these same groups, we have to remember, also ignored evidence of tobacco as a carcinogen, even though that had gone on for years and years and years, and it was really obvious before some of these groups coughed up to that Association. And there are 9 physician groups that actually admit the link between abortion and breast cancer: Catholic Medical Association, Breast Cancer Prevention Institute, Pro-Life OBGYNs, and some of the others. And there's actually 4 mechanisms in which breast cancer is caused or at least increased by having an elective abortion. And some of these are actually recognized and accepted, so it sort of defies the imagination why it isn't put on as one of the commonly accepted risk factors. But if a woman doesn't have a child, compared to a woman who does have a child, having a child reduces your risk of breast cancer. So if you have an abortion, you don't have that risk reduction. And then another way in which it reduces risk is a woman will delay her first full-term pregnancy. So some of what protects you in pregnancy is having that pregnancy really early. And then there is another accepted association if a woman has a premature birth. Often this can be caused by abortion. And but at any rate, if she has a premature birth before 32 weeks gestation, this will also raise her risk of abortion. Her risk of breast cancer. So these 3 things are really widely accepted in medicine. So the only contested risk, which we would call the independent leak, means that abortion in and of itself raises the risk of breast cancer independent of the loss of the protective effect of childbearing. And so each subsequent full-term pregnancy reduces the lifetime risk by 10%. Every 1-year delay of a first full-term pregnancy will increase the risk of premenopausal breast cancer by 5% and postmenopausal breast cancer by 3%. So these are very, very well-known associations. So the woman who has an abortion has a greater breast cancer risk than the one who has a full-term pregnancy, and a full-term pregnancy reduces the risk, but induced abortion does not. There's a very interesting model that's called the Gale model, and you can actually Google it and find the Gale model and plug yourself into this. And you put in some of your common demographic characteristics such as race, age, menarche, age at the first birth, some of your family history of breast cancer, breast biopsies, and it will give you your 5-year risk of breast cancer and your lifetime risk. And what we can see here that's really obvious is the effect of the age of the first birth. So even independent of the independent link of abortion and breast cancer, let's say a woman is pregnant at the age of 18. And if we look in the 2 left columns there, if she has the baby at age 18, her lifetime risk of having breast cancer, presuming she doesn't have relatives with breast cancer, is 6.5%. But if she aborts the baby, and even if there isn't an independent link, and then she goes on to have another child at age 32, her lifetime risk is 12.1%. So this is indisputable. And the thing is, the big reason for the increase in breast cancer in the world has to do with the reproductive patterns of women. And this is having fewer children, delaying childbearing, and then whatever additional effect hormonal therapies, abortion, pollution, and all of these other things might have. And this, the American Cancer Society admits this. So somewhere in this lies abortion. And now I want to go into some of the biological reasons for the ABC link. In the first few months of pregnancy, the breasts grow under the influence of pregnancy hormones, estrogen in particular, and any woman who's been pregnant knows this. Sometimes one of the first things you feel when you're pregnant is your breasts are tender. And then with the stimulation of the pregnancy hormones, estrogen and a little bit later progesterone, the number of the immature cells increase markedly in number in that first trimester. and going into the second trimester. So if a mother has an abortion or a premature birth before 32 weeks gestation, she's left with a lot more of these proliferative cells that are places for the cancers to start. And in fact, if you look technically, it's what is happening in the DNA of the cells in early pregnancy. They're in a stage of cell division where the DNA is really, really circulating. And so they're much more vulnerable for bad cells and cancer cells to develop from them. So it is only in the hormonal environment that occurs after 32 weeks of pregnancy that there's some of the cancer-preventing hormones, in particular human placental lactogen. And these are very elevated in late pregnancy. And so they cause the breast lobules to go through specific stages of maturation, and they cause them to be cancer-resistant. So the breast maturity influences a woman's breast cancer risk, and they only really fully go to the last stage at the end of pregnancy. So the breasts go to a certain degree through these stages in puberty and then throughout pregnancy. And so what we can see here is there's different types of lobules. And it's a unit of tissue in the breast that consists of a milk duct and ductules. And during puberty, type 1 lobules mature into type 2 lobules as a result of the effect of estrogen and progesterone. And so at this stage, there's type 1 and 2 lobules, and they're very cancer susceptible. During during full-term pregnancy, the lobules mature into type 3 cells, into type 4 cells that are milk producing. And then after pregnancy, when they no longer produce milk, they retain the protective genetic changes and become type 3 lobules. So we can see during pregnancy, this is what happens. You start out with type 1 and type 2 lobules. After puberty, before pregnancy, there's these types. At the end of the first trimester, there's a great increase in the type 1 and 2 lobules. And then at the end of the third trimester, at the end of pregnancy, there's a lot of these type 4 lobules. And then at the end of lactation, there's the type 3 lobules. But then the breast is really resistant at this point. So this goes into it a little more, what happens throughout a pregnancy, and the percentage of lobules that are of these different types. So the longer a woman is pregnant before an abortion takes place, the more places there are for the cancers to start to grow until she gets into the very last trimester. If she has an abortion, a premature birth before 32 weeks, she'll be left with more places for the cancers to start. At any rate, that's sort of the basis of the biology behind the ABC link. Now let's talk about experimental studies in animals and then studies in humans that demonstrate the ABC link. There were really good animal experiments by the Russos, who work in Philadelphia. And they actually did rat experiments. And there's a particular kind of rat that's very susceptible to cancer. They're called Sprague-Dowley rats. And they were given actually DMBA, which is a carcinogen. So if you give these rats these carcinogens, pretty close to 100% of them will get cancer. And so there were actually 4 groups in here. And if we look here, P and L means pregnancy, and L means lactation. And so the lactation protected them somewhat. But in group 1, the animals had pregnancy and lactation, and 11% of them ended up with the tumors. A small number. If they just had the pregnancy in group 2, none of them had the tumors. But P-int means interrupted pregnancy. These are aborted rats. 77% of them had the tumors. And then 4 and 5 are rats who never got pregnant. So they're missing the protective effect of the pregnancy. But we still see here that the aborted rats had here we see. The aborted rats had quite a bit higher rate than the ones who went through a full-term pregnancy, and somewhat higher than the ones who didn't have any rat pups at all. And so when we look at risk for breast cancer, there's different ways of expressing risk. One way is cumulative lifetime risk, the percentage of women in a whole lifetime who will develop breast cancer. Another way is incidence, the number of women per 100,000 population that will get breast cancer. And then the easiest way, or one of the most common ways that you see in studies, is relative risk. And so this is a number that's used to compare with the average associated with developing a disease. So the average is usually expressed as 1.0 in relative risk. If a relative risk is 1.0, there is no increase or decrease from the factor that's being studied. If the relative risk is 1.5, there's a 50% increase. If it's 2.0, there's a doubling of the risk. And if the relative risk is 0.5, there's actually a 50% decrease. And so if we look at people who have studied the relationship between abortion and breast cancer, this was not really studied until the 50s and 60s. And there were some countries where breast cancer became legal before the US. The earliest studies in the US happened after Roe v. Wade. So in Japan, actually, after World War II, abortion was legalized there. And the very first study that's not very well known showed a relative risk of 1.6, or was it 2.6? Yeah, no. Yeah, 2.6, excuse me, relative risk of 2.6, really pretty substantial in women who had had an abortion. And then the most famous study in the US was done right here at USC by Pike. And he studied, in particular, he was interested in young women. And one of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s is both the birth control pill became much more in common use, and abortion was legal. And so he actually studied both. And he picked as his subjects young women under 32, because this hadn't been seen before. And one of the things we're seeing now is very, very young women are getting breast cancer. And the study was primarily focused on oral contraceptives, but also he found that induced abortion increased breast cancer 2.4-fold. And this was sort of really a shocking study. And the thing that happened immediately after this was there was a whole spate of editorials and articles saying, this can't be so, we don't believe it, how can this be? You know, incredible denial, and on a very large public scale. And immediately, a lot of institutions went into high gear to disprove it. So there was a whole spate of studies that came after this. But despite those, there was another study, particularly on young women, that was actually sponsored by the National Institutes of Cancer, and at a very respectable place, the Fred Hutchinson Institute in Seattle. And the purpose of it was really to disprove that there was an ABC link. Well, guess what they found? Janet Daling studied 845 premenopausal women, and she found the risk of breast cancer was 50% higher in those with induced abortion. And it was particularly high if the young women had abortion in adolescence. When, again, if we look at what's happening biologically, there's a lot of DNA turnover in adolescence. And that's added to the DNA turnover in early pregnancy. And of this group, of the under 18 year of age women, some of them had a family history of breast cancer, mothers and sisters, in particular first-degree relatives. And guess what percentage of these women developed breast cancer? 100%. 100% of these women. And so this was in the NIH study that was supposed to prove that there wasn't an ABC link. And it's really tricky when you have researchers in institutions that come up with stuff like this, okay, because she did a couple more studies like this, but kind of gave it up because it's career busting. And it's hard on researchers. And some of them who find stuff like this have buried it, and actually they've told people this, that they found this, but they're just not going to put it out there. So there's other information like this that's been buried. Most epidemiological studies support an independent link beyond just the protective effect of pregnancy. And the most famous article that came out was in 1996, and it's by Joel Brind, and it was a meta-analysis of all of the studies that existed to that point on breast cancer and abortion. And he found that 18 of the 23 studies found risk increases for women with abortions. They weren't necessarily huge increases, and he tried also to tease out the independent link from the protective effect of childbearing. But overall, what he showed was that there was a 50% increased risk in women whose abortions took place before their first full-term pregnancy, and even 30% whose abortions were after their first full-term pregnancy. So after some of these things came out, and especially after the 1996 meta-analysis, which got a lot of publicity, there were many studies. They were all done on the same database and had different authors. Many of them were published in The Lancet, but they were very, very flawed. First of all, the statistics were manipulated to subtract some of the women from there, or some of the women from the studies, and especially some of the Danish database. They made some assumptions. They assumed that the women, since abortion hadn't been legal before a certain time, they assumed that women never had abortions, and we know that isn't true. If it was difficult to get an abortion, women in Europe would simply go somewhere else. And the other main thing these articles did was they failed to allow sufficient time to elapse between the exposure to abortion and the development of breast cancer. And in fact, they misclassified women who had abortions as not having them just because they weren't in the database. And we know actually that there's fraud in research and things are covered up. And there was a very, very interesting study in Nature magazine of scientists, and they were surveyed, and not that many committed outright fraud and falsified data, but 2% actually admitted to doing this. But 13% ignored data, and 16% admitted to changing the design methods or results of the study in response to pressure from a funding source. Yeah. And some of the more recent studies have actually acknowledged the ABC risk. Since 2007, there have been 7 studies, and they've been conducted all over the world, in China, Western Europe, Iran, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and all of these have found the ABC link. And it's interesting, you won't always find that there's a relationship in the headlines. You might not even find it in the written summary. But if you look at actually the data, you may find it there. And it was really interesting. There was at one point when I went over every single article, and there's a number of them where they clearly show it and it's just not mentioned. It's in the stats, it's in the tables, and they just don't go into it and don't explain it. And so this came to a head because there were actually some state legislatures that passed right-to-know acts. I know this happened in Minnesota and happened in Texas to give women an accurate appraisal of their risks before they had an abortion, and some of the legislatures passed this. And so there was a National Cancer Institute workshop on early reproductive factors in breast cancer. And they claimed to have reviewed the entire literature, but only studies that did not show the ABC link were presented. And the researchers who found the ABC link were not invited to present. The invited scientists were not experts in this, and in fact hadn't done work on this, but they were sort of other people that were brought in to review this. And the ones they brought in were ones whose careers developed on federal grants. And one of them told Joel Brind that they would lose their government grant if they said there was an ABC link. And there were 3 new studies that were announced, And the typical thing for a workshop like this is for them to be circulated among the participants in the workshop. But they didn't do this. They weren't shown to anybody until it was all over. And in fact, predictably, a majority report was issued from this, and the conclusion was that there was no ABC link. And so this kind of manufactured NCI workshop was used as the basis to withdraw some of the legislation that had already been passed. And so Minnesota, and I think another state, because the NCI said that there was no ABC link, was pressured into removing the so-called scientifically invalid conclusion from their right-to-know literature. And why was the ABC link covered up? One of the major presenters was Leslie Bernstein. And this is what she said. The biggest bang for the buck is the first birth, and the younger you are, the better off you are. But I would never be a proponent of going around and telling them that having babies is the way to reduce your risk. I don't want the issue relating to induced abortion to breast cancer risk to be part of the mix of the discussion of induced abortion, its legality, its continued availability. So this, I would say, extreme pro-abortion ideology is really responsible for distorting the science that's really there. So if you have questions about this and want more information, like I said, the BCPI Institute site is a really good one. And when there's new studies, they're reviewing them all the time, and you can sign up for their newsletter.